you know, help yourself to whatever you need to do. I want to first welcome our host and granting agency, the Central Minnesota Arts Board. Without them, we could not have come so far. So Heather, Allen, if you can say a few words.
Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Allen. I use she, her pronouns, and I am privileged to be the Director of Programs and Outreach for the Central Minnesota Arts Board, and we exist to invest in artists and people who support the arts in 4 counties in Central Minnesota. And Hedy's been an invaluable partner as an artist, as a racial equity champion in Central Minnesota, and as a colleague. So I'm just honored and happy always to be able to support this good work that Hedy does, and to have a chance to spend a little time with all of you. So welcome, and thank you, Hedy, for sharing, and Pacyinz for sharing your talents and wisdom and the things that you're learning with all of us.
Over to you, Pacyinz. Oh, you are muted.
Thank you very much,
Hello?
Hedy. Can you hear me?
Okay,
great.
we hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yes, thank you very much, Hedy, for inviting me to be part of your journey, trying to collect your family's history, your father's history, and contribute to more knowledge of the Southeast Asian diaspora in the US and in Minnesota especially. I'm Hmong American. I lived for many, many years in Minnesota, so I still consider Minnesota one of my home states. I'm currently residing in Washington, DC. I've been writing poetry and publishing poetry for about a little bit over 20 years. I really started my poetry journey with the Asian American Renaissance and Hmong Fador voice in the Twin Cities way back then. So it always really pleases me to be able to participate in events that are affiliated to Minnesota and the Asian American communities in Minnesota and the artist community in Minnesota.
Before I introduce myself, I was wondering if the folks on here would introduce themselves perhaps in the chat. Put your names if you like, pronouns if you like, and especially where you're coming from, because already we have folks from Detroit, from Massachusetts, from Australia, from California, and so on. So put that in the chat, and that's lovely. And I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Several years ago, I promised an Anishinaabe elder and water carrier that I would do this before any of my presentations. So if you can place your feet flat on the surface that you're at and feel that earth below your feet. Here in St. Cloud, Minnesota is the traditional land of the Dakota and Anishinaabe. Pacyinz in Washington, D.C., it is. Pacyinz.
Now I'm in California.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yes, but I know that there's a native tribe here, maybe the Chukchansis. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's not just enough to acknowledge Indigenous people, but we must be part of that movement to reclaim their lands and challenge broken treaties and promises. So again, I am Hedy Tripp, originally from Singapore. I've been in America for the last 43 years, with the last 33 in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Worked in several nonprofit organizations, nurtured an amazing multicultural, multi-ethnic family. I'm a retired lecturer in Asian American Studies at St. Cloud State University, and currently focusing on being a poet, a writer, a memoirist. Pacyinz and I met in the Zoom world of poetry about 2 years ago, and actually have yet to meet in person, the little cabin. And through this grant, I am honored to have her as my mentor in my development as a memoirist. So we have been working on this. Again, this is a poster that Pacyinz put together. If you want to say a little bit about it.
Sure. So yes, as Hedy mentioned, Hedy and I have been collaborating on various things and attending each other's events for about 2 years now, even though most of it has been virtual. However, what became clear is that despite the fact that we come from different parts of Asia and we are also one generation apart, our stories and histories intersect in so many ways. So we decided that, and Hedy actually thought, hey, it would be great if we had this collaborative event which will focus on our patriarchal lines from our fathers, her father and my grandfather. And the poster really looks at the top, you have my grandfather, who was a community leader, a political figure in Laos during the 40s, 60s. And then, so you have a map of Southeast Asia. What we found out in our poetry classes is that a lot of times, especially in the US, when people think about Southeast Asia, they think about the Vietnam War, and then they think about Indochina, really, which was only Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, not even Thailand. Thailand was on the side. But Southeast Asia actually also encompasses, the peninsula. So you have Singapore and then all the islands. You have the Philippines, and all the other Indonesian islands, Malaysia, and all of those things.
We actually have a map a little later on.
Right. And then Hedy's father, and we just have a couple of scenes from those two places, the places that our fathers, grandfathers came from.
Yeah, and a disclaimer, we are not historians, we are memoirists, but we want to share these memoirs with you and how it has intertwined in our own lives. World War II is going to come in, and then the subsequent independence of Singapore and Laos from the colonial powers of Britain and France. And woven into these stories are our stories too. The generational trauma of a daughter and granddaughter of these two men. There is content warning throughout because these are the thoughts and languages of the day. Okay, so here's a current map of Southeast Asia. You can see Laos is over there in blue, and Singapore is this tiny red dot over here. But Southeast Asia is basically 11 countries. Let's see. All right, and so we are going to start with Pacyinz's grandfather.
Thank you, Hedy. So just a tiny bit of introduction about my grandfather, LyFoung, who was born in 1917. He was significant in Hmong American history because he was one of the Hmong history change makers in Laos. His life work really focused on establishing the Hmong people as an essential ally and people of Laos. He worked really hard to integrate the Hmong people of Laos within the new Lao country that was being born after World War II. He was a recognized Hmong leader, both by the French and then the Lao officials and governments. He held several high-level political positions in the Lao government during his tenure. He also supported the emergence of a next generation of Hmong leaders. And for example, General Vang Pao, who is about 10, 15 years younger than he, is one of the young Hmong people that he felt, oh, this is a bright guy. All of you guys that come and talk to me, you should talk to him, for wanting to partner with Hmong people in Laos. And Laos really in history has been the only Asian country where Hmong people, who are a minority people and a I guess, became a wandering people after losing their homeland at some point in history, where they were able to achieve self-determination and became parts of the movers and shakers in the future of our new country of the Kingdom of Laos back in the 50s.
And so we are trying to intertwine the stories of our homelands. I'll let Pacyinz talk a little bit more about the history here of Laos and the Hmong. You want to do that? And then I'll go into the Eurasians.
Great, thank you, Hedy. So Hmong people, as mentioned before, are reportedly a very old people. I mean, they've been existing for and around for thousands of years. Some of the histories say that they may have traveled north to south throughout Asia, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, but we don't know. Some of the most recent histories in the past couple hundreds of years were recorded in China, and in the Chinese historical records, there are some records of Hmong minority communities, and then wars and clashes and things like that. What we do know as Hmong people from Laos, most of the Hmong people who are currently in the US came as part of the refugee resettlement and then the diaspora after the Vietnam War. So most of the people who came from Laos share this history where at the turn of the 19th century going into the 20th century, a lot of Hmong people migrated south and crossed the borders between China and Laos and other countries as well. So like you can find Hmong people at the borders of China and Thailand and Burma and Vietnam and Laos.
So the Hmong are an ancient people, whereas
Yes.
the Eurasians in Singapore really came about when the colonialists came in, particularly Portuguese, Dutch, and British, and they married into or had unions with Asian women, and that's only in the 16th or 18th century. I have a poem here that I want to describe a little bit more about Eurasians in Singapore. Settler imperialism were dreams of riches beyond compare, of exotic native women, the crosses they had to bear, in the righteousness of proselytization, in the power of domination. Settler colonialists were our European ancestors, Portuguese and Dutch seafaring men, encouraged to take root in foreign soil, wooing and wedding or forcibly taking native Asian women, both common and royal. So we are a tiny racial community in Singapore. And this is my father in his youth. His name is Harold Bruins. Bruins is a Dutch name, but it is like 8 generations ago. And the Eurasian progeny has grown, mattressing colonial rule with soft sexuality and astute administration. The Eurasian community flourished internally, even discouraging the ethnic dilution of marriage to other Asians. You can see some of the faces there of Eurasians, men of dark and fair complexions, women amorous in their ambiguity, adapting to changing colonial powers, loyal to foreign domination. So more than 100 years ago in Singapore, in 1909, my father was born a British subject, because this was a British colony of King Edward VII. That's the great-great-great-grandfather of Britain's new king, Charles III. Privileged with the fluency of British English and education, my father became a clerk of the British government of Singapore, always subordinate to Europeans, because they were the only ones who occupied the top leadership positions. Sikit Atas, that's Malay for just above the other brown races, and part of Britain's hierarchical control of non-white races. So here is the beginning of World War II. And 1940 was when the Japanese reached Indochina. And this is yours.
Right. So yes, so as we recall, I guess, back in the days of World War II, you basically had two sides, right? You had the Germans who actually were allied to the Japanese, yeah, and then you had the allies who were, I guess, the US, the UK, and some of the other European countries. And there were really, and people forget that there were really two sides of war. One was in Europe, and then one was actually in Asia. And so what Hedy and I have in our histories are really the history of World War II in Asia. And so Japan was definitely in an expansionist mode. And they were trying to basically, I guess, conquer more lands and more peoples and become a greater empire, right? So, and it was interesting because I was talking about one of my Chinese friends about this as well. And he said, oh yeah, actually, because I was telling him that in my grandfather's history, the Japanese came really late to Laos. In 1945, which was a factor of both. From what he said, my Chinese friend said, actually the Japanese were first in China, and they had to like fight their way through China and try to gain control of some of the Chinese territories. And then after that, they came from the Chinese mainland onto the rest of Southeast Asia. The other historical factor around 1945, at least for my grandfather's participation, is that the Germans occupied France around 1940 something in the war, and so there was a change in leadership, and the French actually were subordinate to the Germans. And so as part of that, in some of the colonies, such as Indochina, then the war may not, the same resistance between the French resistance and then people who were, I guess, loyal to the new regime in France and therefore no longer fighting the Germans and the Japanese, I guess. There was that split as well. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about my grandfather's role in 1945. That's kind of my understanding of World War II in Southeast Asia and in Laos. Back to you, Hedy.
All right. So we go back to that map again. And so we're going back to 1940, the Japanese reached French Indochina. Pearl Harbor happened December 7th, 1941 in Hawaii. Now, this was actually 2 a.m. Singapore time of December 8th. And in 2 hours, the first bombs were dropped on Singapore. So the bombings happened in sync with each other. The actual invasion of Japanese into Singapore wasn't till 1942. So I thought that was really interesting, the strategy that the Japanese had. World War II, the Battle of Singapore, from February 8th to the 15th of 1942. And it was said to be the worst, disaster in British history because Singapore was seen as impregnable but the Japanese came, as you can see, in bicycles. Even when they didn't have rubber tires on their bicycles, they still used the metal wheels and they came from the north. Whereas my father was put in on the shores of Singapore facing south. They thought that the Japanese would come from the south. but it was his diary that I found in my mother's things. It was like this, folded up. And when I opened it, it looked like that. And I couldn't read it. It was such tiny writing. So what I did was I scanned it, magnified it, and painstakingly transcribed it. And that's the first page. And I'll read you a little bit of what it says. February 8th, 1942 is when the battle starts. His diary starts on February 9th. And I'm hearing his voice through this diary. February 9th, enemy planes were spotting us whenever we went. February 10th, I met a guy named Louise. He was shabbily dressed and in an exhausted state. He told us some of his experience in the front line. He said that he was made prisoner but escaped by using his Tommy gun. So this is the writing that I transcribed. February 11th, we jumped into the truck to Bukit Timah. This is the only hill that's in Singapore. We took up positions up on the hills and around. Before we could take up positions, we were machine gunned by enemy planes. We were in the drains on both sides of the road. A truck loaded with barbed wire was machine gunned, stopped just in front of my section. There were around 4 or 5 hits on the truck, and 1 or 2 hits were just a yard in front of me. Shells were bursting around us. Snipers were potting at us here and there. And in spite of all these, we just carried on. By Jove, it was really hell let loose. I took charge of the Lewis gun. Now remember, this is the writings that he did when he was a POW. Let me see. February 12th, heavy shell fire from the enemy. One regular sergeant I spoke to about an hour before received a direct hit. Whatever remains they could collect of him, they buried in the shell hole. February 13th, in the morning we were told to move to another position. While going up the hill, about 3 or 4 shots were seen bursting around my section. Number 15 platoon took up positions right in front of the whole battalion, and I was in charge of the point section. Shells and mortar fire were bursting all around us like nobody's business. February 14th, early morning, many planes hit just around us. We could even see the pilots throwing hand grenades at us. During the night, we had to keep watch, only to be awakened every now and again by bursting of shell fire just near us, or by mortar or rifle or by machine gun fire. Gradually, we became used to it. That's a little scary in terms of him becoming used to this fighting. 15th of February, 1942. At about 2 p.m., my scout said that he saw a white flag and a Union Jack driven in a car going up to Johor, which is in Malaysia. When I sent that message to HQ, they said they were the 5th column. Why didn't they shoot those in the car? Actually, we were told later in the evening that Singapore had surrendered at 4 p.m. on the 15th of February, 1942. So it was my scout that saw that, but his scout, that saw that white flag. This is a very famous picture of the surrender of Singapore. Why did he fight? Why did my father not run away like some of the others? And he says, again, writing in this tiny little writing, I remained because of my beloved wife, mother, home, and my service in the government, which is the British government. So they were loyal to the crown meaning the British crown. Now, this is an important paper that I found. Again, I didn't know its significance. I brought it to a professor friend of mine, Professor Kyoko Kishimoto, a Japanese American, who translated this for me. And this is a document that was going to be sent to my mother, saying that Lance Corporal Harold Bruins was being documented for the Hakodate camp. So this is Hakodate in the northernmost part of Japan. It states his nationality was Eurasian and that he was captured in February 15th, 1942. So these papers I was able to in my research, actually, you know, every part made sense. Every part was part of that. And this picture that we saw at the back of it has 1174. And in this document, as you can see, it's 1174. So that was his POW number. But that settled his fate, that then they knew that he was going to Japan. Not all Eurasians went to Japan as prisoners of war. Many were sent to the death railway in Burma and Thailand. So this is his journey to Japan. From Singapore to Saigon, this is what he wrote. They're on the hell ship Wales Maru. In the early morning of 4th of June, 1943, at about 10 a.m., we heard guns firing on board. Nips, that's what the name they used for Japanese, running here and there and everyone into the hold, and we snatched our life belts. One of our officers and the doctor saw the periscope about 30 to 50 yards from our stern, and that they saw the path of a torpedo just past our ship. So he was torpedoed about here, but luckily they did not catch it. When he arrived briefly in Saigon, that was probably the time that he was closest to where Tubi was in Laos. But then their lives diverged because he was taken then by rail and forced marched into the island of Hakodate, to the prison camps there. And then in his the last pages here, there's not too much that he writes about the time that he spends in as a prisoner of war. But here we can see armistice, 15/8/45. So remember, this is the British way of doing the dates. They put the day first and then the month and then the year. So this is August 15, 1945. And you can see he underlined it twice. And this is also the date that Emperor Hirohito announced an unconditional surrender, citing the devastating power of a new and most cruel bomb. And as we know, that is the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the thousands of people that were killed. But in a way that freed my father. It had been, you know, more than 3 years that he had been a prisoner of war. So what was Tubi doing at that time? Yeah.
Yes. So first of all, what I wanted to do is just provide some type of geographical refresher as to why Tubi and why LyFoung in all of those things. And one of the frames of reference is, for example, looking at Dien Bien Phu, which later on will be discussed. But at any rate, so Dien Bien Phu is located close to the Laos and Vietnamese border. It's up north, pretty close to China as well. And Plan des Jarres is really where you had a lot of Hmong people. So between Sam Luang and Plan des Jarres, like in the area of Plan des Jarres, it was really San Quang province and San Quang city. My grandfather was raised in Nong Head, which is just a little bit east of that. And most of his life is really spent here until he went to Vientiane, which is way down in the south, like around here, to or actually way down here in the south, not south, but south of where he used to be, to be part of the Lao government. But at any rate, here you show the bigger map that really shows all the border between Laos and Vietnam. And a lot of Hmong people lived basically in this area, like more in the northern border. So that was a strategic location for the Hmong people who are really a tribal people that lived on the hills between the borders of the countries. The next slide, Hedy. So here, yes, so it's the same map, again, referencing Dien Bien Phu as a point of reference. And then looking at, so Xian Kuang is here. So Dien Bien Phu would have been like in Visitor Deep, somewhere in the middle. You can see here, there's that little hardship thing, which is also seen here. And so Xian Kuang, where it was a Hmong province, it became a Hmong province. And then Nong Het, a little bit on the side, was where a lot of Hmong people that my grandfather, both of my grandfathers, their families came from there. So next slide. The one before, I think. There's one in between that is after this. Okay, so this is the landscape. So Xian Kuang itself was a very, nice spot. It's very hilly. It was very lush. You have a plain deja. It has like those ancient stone things, and they have always been associated with Hmong people. So that's why, I guess this is a current tourism picture, but the way that they advertise it still with, Hmong people. This picture is actually the city of Xian Kuang City, which was a capital city for Xian Kuang province. And it's, it's a nice little small town in between mountains, and you see all the lush greens, very fertile, a lot of good agriculture and all of those things. And then you had Hmong villages, probably, in the mountains here, villages like this, just perched on little villages. And so when Tubi really started, I mean, he was in one of those little villages, right? Hmong people did not live in Xian Kuang City at the beginning. They were all in little villages like that. And one of the people that was working with the French way back was my grandfather Tubi's maternal grandfather. And then later on, he went to his son-in-law, who was then a LyFoung, actually LyFoung, the original LyFoung, Xiafeng Li. And then, as we will see later, my grandfather inherited that. But I wanted to also contrast to, this is in the corner here, you have a picture of Long Tieng. Long Tieng is a very famous military headquarters for the Hmong forces during the Vietnam War. And so what I wanted to contrast was the fact that between the time when I guess World War II was taking place, or even the wars of independence in Vietnam in the early 50s, to the 60s and 70s when the Vietnam War was taking place. So about 20 years, there was a huge difference in the ways that the Hmong were involved. But at that time, the Hmong were really part of the defense, and the alliances with Western powers had shifted from the French to the US. But at any rate, during the Vietnam War, I met somebody, a pilot in Minnesota, who told me that this runway, I guess, is famous for all the pilots in the world as the shortest runway ever. And so this is the runway that really allowed the Americans and the Hmong to fight very efficiently, actually, at the border. And you really had to be very, I guess, both daring and skilled to be able to land your planes on this really short strip of runway. And then, so the US built the runway, and the Hmong village then, the Hmong village in the sense that all the military Hmong people were here. So my maternal grandfather, General Van Cao, had a big house there. And then a lot of the military Hmong officers, and then their families, and then the military families. But overall, I mean, only some of the officers' families, because most of the soldiers' families were not, I mean, they stayed in their villages, and they were not really at the site of fighting. But there were a couple of families, and Long Tieng was really like a Hmong city as well. In addition to Xian Kuang. Xian Kuang was a majority Hmong city, at some point, and then Longtang as well. So those were strongholds of the Hmong community in Laos. Next slide.
No, before we leave that, the stone structures here is part of the plain of jars, right?
Yes, and
And-
so and the Hmong people did not build them; they were already there, and been there for thousands of years. But they have always been part of the landscape of Singapore province. And I think because in the 50s, 60s, 70s, Hmong people lived in this area, so they've been affiliated with, I guess, Hmong history in that sense. I mean, Hmong Lao history, yeah.
And that was the area that was probably the most bombed during the Vietnam War. So we've moved a little bit from World War II to the Vietnam War here. I'm not sure if we are going back.
Yeah, and then if you read the history of my grandfather's life, his whole life there were always wars going on. One on another, you know, either one or another kind of war going on. So the official title of my grandfather, which is the most honorable title that he got, and a lot of people still remember him this way, is Panya to be LyFoung. And we'll find out later how he got that title. But at any rate, so some of the key dates for Panya to be LyFoung during World War II were actually that he was not involved. So in 1939, schooling was very much interrupted. You know, I mean, I think people who went to school never really did straight, you know, schooling the way that people do now. So my grandfather's high school years were actually very interrupted. He was sick at some point, all of those things. And actually he ended up going to, I think he was in Vientiane first when he was trying to finish the lycée. And then he ended up going to Vinh, which was actually in one of the maps. It was in Vietnam. And it actually reminds you how Indochina was really, you know, a French protectorate. And so the borders between those different countries were very porous. It was not unusual for young men mostly to cross the border and go to study in Vietnam because that's where the schools would be, right? Vietnam.
Whereas with my father, the British system focused very heavily on education, and he passed the school certificate, so that's 12th grade, and I think he might have gone further than that, but and then to get a job, as I had said earlier, your grandfather got a French administrative job, and my father got a British administrative job.
Right.
But for Singapore, the head people were always British. Were the head people always French in Laos at that time?
So no, actually, so what was happening is that actually the French would defer to local administrators, right? Which is why there was one Hmong administrator who used to be my grandfather's grandfather, yeah. And and then I think they had also, you know, Lao administrators. But as you know, some Vietnamese people have reminded us, Vietnam used to be really the headquarters of the French administration in Indochina, and therefore a lot of the I guess Vietnamese staff were also the overseers of the other Indo-Chinese countries. So that, and because of that, I guess there's also, you know, we were just talking about how at some level, and some of the Vietnamese said they have to acknowledge that, which is that in their mind, they kind of think of the other Indo-Chinese countries as their estates as well, right? Because it's kind of it's the colonial tradition of having Vietnam be the top administrator in Indochina, and also being responsible for the other territories. So at any rate, my grandfather went to finish, yeah. So he finished his you know, high school diploma in Vinh, which was a city in Vietnam, and then he came back after graduation just to kind of visit the family before deciding what else he should be doing. And then his dad just told him, "Hey, why don't you just help me with my job right now, which is to be the Hmong administrator for the French government, right, in the region." And at the time, getting a high school diploma was actually a very high level of education. So my grandfather was already the most educated Hmong person, in the area and maybe in the country at the time, with a high school diploma from a Vietnamese high school, right? A Vietnamese French high school. So
Next slide.
no, I
Okay.
just finished this. So my grandfather started helping his father, but his father had an accident and passed away not long after. And my grandfather was named interim administrator, and later on there was a huge, argument around whether the title and position should go back to his grandfather, his low grandfather's family, and that didn't take place, which is why some people trace the divide between the Lees, the LyFoungs, the Lees, and the Laos to that time, which also was impactful for the way that the Hmong people divided between the Laos, who allied with the communists because the French had rejected them, and then my grandfather, who continued being the ally of the French. So, right. And during most of World War II, my grandfather was just busy with that job and making sure that Hmong people were organized and represented and also heard by the French and the Lao. Okay.
Fascinating. Okay. Then you've got.
So in 1945, actually, my grandfather finally got, involved in the in World War II, and it starts with, and I can read from his book. So what happened to my grandfather, because he was one of the few Hmong people who could read and write at the time, is that he had a journal, and my father actually spent quite a bit of his later years to translate his journal from, I think it was in Lao, and then it had to be translated into Hmong, and then translated to English, and then now he's trying to translate it into French, and we'll see if that will happen. The other book that my father collected and put together was the letters of my grandfather, because my grandfather was writing his children in the 60s and 70s, as they had all gone to the universities in France at the time. So at any rate, I will read from my grandfather's journal, understanding that it is a translation and therefore some things may be lost. But my grandfather talks about how, in March of 1945, he finally made contact with some French people who said, "We come to you because we need help." And so he actually recorded what the French officer told him, who was Captain Eros, who was 25 years old at the time. He said, "I'm the new commander. Currently, I represent the new French government in the province of Singapore. I am here to replace Captain Sir Eros, who has already gone back to France. Captain Eros sends his warm thanks to you, Mr. Tooby. He would like you to know that he feels very sorry about not being able to come and thank you in person." So actually that was after my grandfather had already helped Captain Eros and his troops flee with 2 Hmong scouts who could take them through the forest. And now I guess he has a new officer that came to talk to him. And this new officer, let me...
Oops.
Okay, maybe later on we'll get to his name. Oh yeah, I think he's gonna say what his name is. So yes, he was very happy. This is still the French officer talking to him. He was very happy to get the assistance of your 2 young Hmong men, whom he called les infatigables petits guerriers noirs aux pieds nus, or tireless barefooted small black warriors. The young men were hardworking, patient, and obedient, and they did not like to talk much. They wore black clothes and had no shoes. They walked and led the French soldiers through mountains and valleys without any sign of fatigue and without even asking for any rest. Captain Eros said that he had to ask the 2 men many times before they agreed to let his troops stop for a break. Yeah. Your Hmong men knew the country very well and were able to lead the French to safety. I am new. I do not bring with me any handful of money to give to you, Mr. Tooby, but I would like you to come and stand by my side to help me carry out the orders of a new French government, General de Gaulle. So I guess that was when France was liberated, actually. the new French leader, has promised that he will grant independence to all French colonies so that those countries can be governed by their own people as the people wish it. In the future, France will stay out of those countries' affairs and will help them only if there is a need. I personally believe that General de Gaulle will keep his word and will grant independence back to the Lao country. So that was Capitaine Bichelot, and that's how I guess my grandfather got involved with the French, first helping Captain Errols flee through the jungles, and then helping Captain Bichelot that came to replace him when I guess when France was liberated, but they were still fighting the resistance in Asia. The main thing to remember about, I guess, to these experiences during World War II also was that because of all his, I guess, not very active, but helping on the side, the French soldiers, then somebody, maybe, you know, some of his enemies had denounced him to the Japanese occupiers, and he was actually arrested and, you know, kind of tortured. And then he realized that he was not safe and his family was not safe. So from April of 1945 to September of 1945, my grandfather lived in the jungle with his family. It was very difficult, and the family history does recall that one of his brothers passed there, and his first wife also passed there. She died in childbirth along with a child. My grandfather wrote a poem about his experience in the jungle, and I will read that as well. We rested and slept under the trees. Before lighting the fire, we looked around carefully. We picked up fruit and got dinner for free. We did not use our guns to shoot at monkeys. We used traps to catch birds and rodents. We moved around and changed our resting place very often. We traveled on forest paths only, so the Japanese enemy could not see. They wanted to catch us, but they could not do so. Sometimes at night, we had to move on and go. We walked across mountains and valleys. Sometimes it rained and we were all wet. We were cold and shaky, but we continued our walk. We climbed high mountains and big rocks. The babies were the most difficult to take care of. They were hungry and they cried a lot. The mothers were helpless. They joined their hands and prayed for help. The evil Japanese were going to lose. I have an important thing to say too. The Japanese were very bad men. They tied my relatives and kicked them. They tortured my relatives and forced them to betray me. Whoever resisted them was killed for no reason. The Japanese, this cruelty knew no comparison. We escaped from death thanks to God. Our ancestors also helped us a lot. So that was his, you know, experience of World War II as somebody who was attached to the French resistance.
Let me, if I can just interject here, because I forgot to read something that my father wrote also of his experience with the Japanese. He calls it, he'd been suffering under Japanese tyranny in Singapore and in the cold north of Japan. Although he didn't write too much about that in here, he did write a letter to his mother when he was flying to freedom. He writes to Mummy dear, there will be no more rice and watery stew, no more hard labor for me again. Whenever I recall the days of torture, starvation, the dreadful months during the winter, the long hours of work, day and night, the beatings, floggings, and several other inhuman injustices will make anyone mad. How I have gone through all these torture is a thing I am unable to explain. Now, he had never talked to me about this at all. And when I read his letters and the diary, it showed me a resilient side of my father that I never really knew. We didn't have a very good relationship. Whereas with you, Pacyinz, there's so much documentation that you have. I just have these scraps of paper that we're trying to bring out these stories. That is fascinating. So this last bullet point, September 1945, Japan surrenders, and then your grandfather and his family come out of hiding. And then we look
And
at,
then starts the war
Oh.
between the French and the Vietnamese, and and then and the path to independence and new nationhood for the Kingdom of Laos. But this is a picture that I guess is
Yeah.
everywhere. And so the second person here is actually my grandfather at the time. So in 1945, he was how old? He was like 20, 28, something like that.
Mm.
This young man here is actually his younger brother, LyFoung. And LyFoung was instrumental in being able to gain citizenship rights for Hmong people and other minorities in Laos. One thing that Tubi was very clear about is that everything that he was doing was really for his Hmong people. So working with the French, working with the Lao, was always trying to find ways to benefit the Hmong people. So the Hmong people used to be, that those remote tribes that nobody would ever see, nobody would really pay attention to, except they came to collect taxes. However, when the opportunity came to, to have a new country and have independence in Laos, my grandfather always planned ahead and thought, when that happens, then the Hmong people have to be real citizens. They cannot be, a minority tribe, remote, that nobody really pays attention to except when they come to collect taxes.
Mm.
So he planned ahead to, a couple of things happened to him is that so after the war, or rather after World War II, he was still involved with the French, and Singapore City at some point actually was taken by the Viet Minh and the Lao Isira, who were the predecessors of the Viet Cong, right? The Viet Cong, and then the Pathet Lao, which would be the future Lao and Vietnamese communists. At the end of 1945, they had taken Siang Quang City. And my grandfather, Tubi, was actually the Hmong leader who said, hey, we're going to help retake Siang Quang City. Siang Quang City was, in many ways, a place that was friendly to the Hmong people. They were not living there yet, but it had always been a friendly administrative city. And because he was able to retake the city with Hmong troops allied to the French and the Lao, then he got given the Médaille de la Légion d'honneur from the French, and he also got another war medals from the French. So he came to the attention of a Lao king, and the Lao king thought, hey, this guy must be something else, because the French are like awarding him with like all those high honors and everything. And that's when Tubi actually got his honorific title from the French, and that's going to be in the next slide. Actually, I'm already talking about that. But at any rate, so by that time, by that time, Tubi had the ear of the French and the Lao king. And so what he says in his books is that every time he got a chance to meet the king, like when the king invited him to come and get his honorific title, then he would have a conversation with the king, and he would say, Your Majesty, I would love it if more things could be done for the Hmong and other things. And among other things, there is going to be that constitutional assembly that will put together the constitution of the new Kingdom of Laos. And there should be a Hmong person on this committee. And that's how he recommended that, there should be a Hmong person. And I think his brother got selected, and his brother was able to go there and argue for the rights of the Hmong and other minorities to be included as citizens in the new constitution. So the image that we also saw is that they were carrying weapons, because after the Japanese left and the French also kind of withdrew, and they were more busy with Vietnam, then they left a lot of weapons. And the Lao king did not want to have heavily armed Hmong troops, but he did say, you can keep one gun for each Hmong leader, and as kind of an honorific thing. That's why a lot of Hmong leaders were carrying a gun each.
Mm.
So yeah, and yeah, I already talked about this slide, so we can move on. And yeah, so, and after that, it really was, so To Be was very involved he was still involved with the war in Vietnam, because the French would always come and say, hey, can you help us? And during that time, the most significant thing that he did was that he was using the Hmong language as a secret code to help the French. So up to 1953. And when some of the Hmong people said, now that you have written the Hmong language, which had not been written before, can we use it to learn our language? But my grandfather made the decision at the time, which for which he is sometimes criticized, is that he told Hmong people, we are becoming citizens of the Kingdom of Laos, and therefore our official language is going to be Lao. And he didn't want to push the Hmong language at the time. So there was already the Lao and the French languages to learn. So he just said, let's not push for learning the Hmong language at this time. So he didn't push for using his, transcription of the Hmong language. And later on, missionaries came up with their own Romanification and transcription in writing of the Hmong language. But yeah, the decolonization was a lot, fighting a little bit with the French, or helping in the background. And then until 1953, 1954, when the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. And actually my grandfather was involved in putting together a Hmong troop from Xiangkwang, from the Xiangkwang region, to walk all the way up north to Dien Bien Phu, because they were some of the most, I guess, dedicated and loyal troops. But by the time before they arrived, Dien Bien Phu had already fallen. And so, yeah, they never got to that site, and they just went back home. However, I think in my father's book, it does talk about the fact that on the way back, they took back some of the Hmong families, because once again, what I'm telling people is that Hmong people had to make a choice at the time. They had to choose, are you going to be with the communists? Are you going to be with, the West, who are saying you can be a democracy, you can have your own country as well, right? And so the experience of the Hmong people, at least on my grandfather's side, is that the Vietnamese have never been very friendly. So there were Hmong people in Vietnam who no longer felt safe. So those Hmong troops came back with some Hmong people from Vietnam to resettle in Laos. Yeah,
that's fascinating. And this all sets the scene for Laos and the Vietnam War. Whereas in Singapore, what was happening after the armistice of 1945, the British came back, it in a way recolonized Singapore, but it did allow self-government and free elections, let's say. I was born 2 years after the armistice. And again, I was a British subject of King George VI, and then a British subject of Queen Elizabeth. And there was just in the beginning, a lot of racial and religious violence in terms of the Chinese against the Malay, and also the Eurasians. And then in 1963 was when decolonization, it was no longer a colony of Britain, but instead it joined Malaysia. In a way, the racial violence increased. So 1965 was really its independence. So that is when, 1965, I could become a citizen. You talked about citizenship, right? In Laos and in Singapore, 1965 was when we could become citizens. And the Eurasian community, even though it was small, it took a lot of active political administrative roles in the new government. They took ministerial roles. My father became a bursar, which is like a head accountant of the only teachers training college. So he was able to move from being just a clerk into a higher position. So that came with independence. Now, as we go into the secret wars, it was a secret to me. I mean, Vietnam and Laos was what, 800 miles north of us? And I did not know about what was happening. The news releases in Singapore were all censored. And it was only around 1974 when I met American investigative journalists who were uncovering these stories at great risk to themselves, that I knew of, starting to know about the Vietnam War. And, you know, my father didn't know about it. We didn't talk about it at all. Really, it was a well-kept secret in Singapore. But it wasn't a secret, right, to you, Pacyinz, your family?
Right. So the Hmong people were, you know, definitely part of the war. They were the CIA secret army during the Vietnam War. And once again, the location of the Hmong people and where they were fighting was critical to the Vietnam War. At the beginning, it was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So it was the trail through the mountains where North Vietnam would send supplies and troops to South Vietnam to fight, and gain control of the whole country, right? And so Hmong people, Long Tiang that we saw, also called Lima Site 20, was definitely a critical defense point. At the very beginning, when the US came to recruit the Hmong people, they were not very clear how they were going to use the Hmong people. And at the very beginning, it was mostly about, oh, you know, we have some of our planes that go over the border, they get shot down. You may have people that are wounded or maybe bodies that need to be retrieved. So it was those types of rescue missions. Or there might be troops on the other side and they need supplies. So just go and, you know, bring them supplies. But at some point, I guess the US decided that they really wanted the Hmong to be a fighting force, and therefore they trained them and gave them supplies and had them fly planes as well as really be active fighters. And a lot of them actually were part of the Lao military. I mean, they were really part of the Lao military, and then, but they were assigned to work with the US, right? But it was all, you know, I mean, not talked about officially. Yeah, so this young man here is General Lang Pao, I think, and this is Tubi. So they're like one generation, almost one generation apart. I mean, not quite a generation apart. I think they're half a generation apart, maybe 10, 15 years apart, which is a lot for, I think, men of that time, because time goes pretty fast. But by the time of the 60s, you know, early 60s, Tubi was really, you know, I mean, his fighting days were over. He was fighting back in, you know, 1945 and stuff like that, right? When he was like 20 something, but in 1960, he was 40 something. So he was definitely not in fighting shape, and he was much more involved as a political figure and working for different administrations, being a minister, a junior minister, or things like that. On the other hand, Lang Pao was starting his career. And when he was recruited, he was like maybe, you know, a very young officer, junior officer. And then he became the trusted ally of the Americans, mostly because he had both the strategic mind, but he also had, you know, the charisma to be able to, I guess, to get over Hmong people to support him and support the Americans. So at any rate, yes, there was that. It's not so much a transition. They were really in different spheres. And later on, what happened at the end of the war is that a lot of people who used to be part of the administration, like grandfather to be, resettled in France, and then Hmong people who used to be, you know, part of the military, more than 200, you know, 100,000 something, they resettled in the US because of their ties to the US. So that's kind of.
And Pacyinz, one of the things that war happened, and you mentioned it a little bit, was families were split apart, right?
Yeah, yes,
Right,
yes.
and in different sides. So even within your own family, was everyone for the royal Lao, or were there some that went to Pathala?
Yes. So and so, there were divisions, and especially within like the in-laws, right? We had LyFoung in-laws and we had low in-laws. There was a picture in 1959, I think, in one of the previous slides, that what happened when because Laos was supposed to be a neutral country, so Laos itself, but also their allies, were trying very hard to have a neutral government. A neutral government meant that you had to have all the factions represented. So you would always have the Lao, the royalist side, the right wing, and then you would have the communist, and then you would also have the neutralist. So for many years, since 1954 to 1975, it was a constant struggle to try to put together a neutral government where every faction would be satisfied, right? And so it was very difficult. I mean, one of the good things for my grandfather is that I guess he was actually, he was friendly. I mean, he was a friendly guy, and he was also both by nature, but also, in his mind, he always wanted to be, I mean, for the Hmong people, he always wanted to be kind of in the middle as well, right? But he was also always very clear that he was always on the side of the French and the side of the royalists. So he was always on that side, but he was also acceptable to the other side. So he was always asked to be part of various governments that were formed and everything. And so his career during that time is, for a couple of years, he, every time there would be a new government formed, he would always be asked to be part of that. And so he had so many positions. In one summer, or like in 6 months, he probably was part of 4 different governments that were being, experimented with. Yeah. And then
it was like Singapore, basically it became a one-party government, the People's Actions Party. So there was total control.
Right.
Wasn't this?
But at some point, my grandfather became an advisor to the king, and that was a more permanent position and a more stable position. So I think he always had the ear of the king in some ways, right? So that was also helpful for him.
And for Van Pao, what I've read is that, he sided with the Americans because the Americans helped win the World War II. And so he felt that was a stronger force. But who knows, that's a whole different story again, right?
Right.
What was going on?
Yes.
So
and I should emphasize once again that, it's family. I mean, family tie, everybody is so close to each other, right? And I always tell people that, so the war between the different Lao factions, it was still a war between royal cousins, right? Because the guy who became the head of the Laopedia, the communist country, the communist regime later on, was all, it's only one of the cousins of a king. So the same way that when Tubi and Vang Pao were out, then the Laos came in power because they always sided with the communists. But they're related, they're related to Vang Pao, and they're related to Tubi, we have so many intermarriages. And Vang Pao and Tubi are also related, like me, being their grandkid, having them on both sides of my family. So it's a very small world, and I think it's true of any monarchy, or actually in any country that you have leadership. There are very few families that are, I guess, in leadership, and they kind of switch around, and they've been around for a long time. So it has always been, kind of like that. And so when we talk about betrayals, and we talk about, I don't know, when we talk about really changing regimes and everything, it's always, a lot of times it's fratricide, right? You actually, and the only reason why people can get so close to you is because they are really close to you. So that's also the reality of, how how wars are made, and then how regimes are changed, because you have people really close to you that technically should have been on your side, but they betrayed you at some point. Yeah.
Wow. That is so fascinating. And, you know, for those of you who are still with us, you can see how complicated and these stories are, and how different these two Southeast Asian men experience has been. And I know here we put the unknown, so you don't even know when your grandfather passed, or even where his remains are, right?
Right. So what people never talk about, because I don't know, the new Lao PDR is pretty secretive, and they never want people to remind them of bad stuff. And I think their allies and other countries are not really reminding them of anything as well. But the way that that the war really ended for Laos is that there was supposed to be a neutral government. For 6 months, they were still trying to put together a neutral government. But at the end, in November of 1975, after the US withdrew, and it was pretty clear that the communists would be, in control of Southeast Asia, then
of Laos and Vietnam, right? And Cambodia.
Yes, in Laos, Vietnam, and to a certain extent, Cambodia, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, Cambodia, yeah, as well. So at any rate, the communist faction, the Pathet Lao, invited the other factions to meet them in the north, which were a communist stronghold. And at the time, I guess they asked the king to abdicate, but he didn't want to. So they just detained everybody, and then they were all disappeared. And that's how my grandfather to be disappeared. Vang Pao was, when the US withdrew, he was one of the first ones to be,
evacuated.
Evacuated. And even though my grandfather to be was his in-law, and even though they had on and off been working together, but at that time things were so sensitive, and I think things were especially sensitive in terms of how willing are you to try to work with the other side, right? Then Vang Pao and all their troops, they left without telling anyone where they were going or when they were going, and they disappeared overnight, right? They were airlifted overnight. And then after that, you just had the other people who had to decide, so do we flee as well, or do we stay? And Tubi was one of the people that decided, and he probably was thinking that in his life, there were so many wars, and he always stayed and always tried to make things better and work out with Hmong people. My family talks about the fact that there were so many Hmong people who were not airlifted. So to be thought, okay, he better stay. And he stayed until the end, which is that it's the other side that actually eliminated him. And he didn't leave the country. He was eliminated by the other side when he was taken and disappeared.
I'm still astounded that, in Singapore, we never heard all these stories. And, in my working with you, this is the first time I'm hearing a lot of the deeper part of the stories. I mean, I teach about, secret war and things to the younger students, but there is so much more. And not that he didn't, my father didn't have a hard time, but you can look at these medals here. That's the picture of King George the 7th. I lose count of how many. King George the 6th. Yeah. So King George the 6th was the British monarch during the World War II. And that's where his medals are from. I don't know where the medals are, but thank goodness I have at least this picture. So, they're both sacrificed a lot of themselves to what they felt was right, whether it was right or wrong. I know you have a poem, Pacyinz, and we have 10 minutes. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes for your poem and a few minutes for what I want to end, and then we We'll let
Sure.
our,
Yeah. If there's time, I mean, I wanted to read the second one, but I can just read one, and it's
Heather
fine.
will tell us.
It would be great to have a little bit of Q&A, as well. So I'll just read one, and then if
All
there's
right, just do it.
So this I wrote from my experiences helping my father translate my grandfather's books. It's called The Bright Light for Courage in the Darkest Night. I read through the pages of your letters, the grandfather I never knew, trying to translate your words into this language where your beloved children and people found refuge after the terrible war where a third of our men perished, and where you too died, a death too horrible for your enemies to ever brag about. Testing each word, each comma, each period, each space, I can go so deep into your inner thoughts, sweetest dreams, greatest disappointments, all the things you said, and even those that you did not mean to say. I try to stay true to what you meant to say, interpret what you left unsaid, and respect what can never be said. Line by line, I learned the man you were, the story of our family, the history of a country that should have been mine. I can even taste the rice and bananas and mangoes that my grandmother planted with her own hands on the land that she bought for my father, with the precious money he saved from his scholarship. His dream of coming back after school and live close to his parents. You would have been proud and probably a little bit sad to know he did remain the kind of man happy to buy $2 shoes to save more for his family. As yes, life was hard after losing you, his country, and feeling so heartbroken about both. But everyone had to become a survivor. As the final pages arrive always too soon, it gets harder and harder to read them, knowing the ending is also already written, and that it can never change no matter how many times I edit it or read it. I worry a little that other people will not understand or will maliciously misinterpret your final actions, the dangerous and painful peacemaking missions that no one else would take, convincing Royal Army Hmong soldiers, CIA secret army soldiers left behind, to surrender instead of being massacred, or stopping the too visible flight of masses of scared people from the communists that the new regime was going to shut down. Will they see how great your heart was and how strong your courage was to accept that ungrateful work because you could save so many lives of Hmong people, they who you loved even more than your own life or your family? Coming to your last page and reading your last words, I feel both relieved and quietly sad. They still carry only your hopes of peace and nothing of your darkest days, just a bright light that will give us the courage to live well, which was your deepest desire.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Pacyinz. And you have the voice of your grandfather in these books and that. And I want to leave our wonderful participants here with hearing the voice of my father through two postcards that he sent to my mother when he was a POW in Japan. It's dated August and October of 1944. So let me read this to you. And he has always called her Cherie. Cherie, my darling, I do hope you, Mom, Moses, and the rest are keeping well. The winter here deadly, very cold, blizzard, awful. New experience. Christmas and New Year was better than last year. Love to you all. Cherie, my darling, this is the other one. It's over a year since I left Singapore, and I wonder if my cards have all reached home. I'm writing to Mom this time. The weather's changing. I hope this winter will not be too severe. And in any case, I am prepared for the worst. How is everybody? Give my love to all, with all my love and burning kisses to you, darling. And pray for me. Yours forever, Harold. So this is his voice that I leave with you. So we have told you some stories and some poetry. It's a work in progress. It is being recorded through the Central Minnesota Arts Board, and it will be put in my website for folks to access that. Take a little while, right? A couple of weeks, maybe, Heather, yes? But it'll be available, especially for those who couldn't make it today. Yeah, so we come to the end. We have a few announcements, and then we'll open it up to any questions. So I will actually be doing an in-person breakfast club at the Stearns County Museum, local museum, on October the 12th, going far deeper into his writings. And there's several pictures. He is over here. And that's what I'm doing. And Pacyinz, you want to say a little bit here, and then we can open it to a few minutes of questions if folks have questions.
So my announcements are more like sharing of information, which is that I'm active with two efforts from my family. One of them is the LyFoung Foundation. We try to preserve Tubi's legacy. This is also the vehicle for us to have some family philanthropy and activism. We haven't been very active. Like some of the most active things that we have been doing is, for example, helping my dad publish, my grandfather's books. And we also try to have the family foundation be a source of support for the family members. So we're still working on that. The other thing is that several of us are also active with the Southeast Asia Monitor for Human Rights and Justice, SAMG, which is really focusing on trying to find Tubi's remains 45, 46 years later. He disappeared with a whole bunch of people. So we don't know the extent to which we'll be able to ally with others, but at least we'll try. And for that purpose, we are also trying to pursue human rights in Southeast Asia as those activities would support Tubi's case as well.
Whew. Thank you all for coming here and spending time with us.
So I should say that, thank you. This is sunbird chicken, sunbird's, what is it?
Sunbird.
Yeah, sunbird, which is the national
scarlet sunbird.
Scarlet sunbird, the crimson sunbird, which is the national bird for Singapore. And then there's the opium poppies, which people have a negative connotation, but for example, I'm named for them, and they were my grandmother's favorite flowers because they were a thing of beauty, I think, on the hills where they lived, right? So.
And it's maligned because this is the source of heroin.
Right.
Right. But it is a beautiful flower. Any quick questions? Just come online. And Linda and James, you're unmuted.
I want to thank you for your involving us and giving us a more open eye to the history of your personal experiences. While you were talking, my mind was connecting with my experiences with the Vietnam War, all things I had heard through various forms of media, as well as having worked with Vietnam combat veterans who were more truthful about what was going on as far as they could see. So thank you very much for sharing your experience, knowledge, and artistry with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Linda. Shannara, it's just so lovely to see you. Shannara is on the other side of the world for most of us. Can you unmute? Just say hi. Unmute.
Oh.
Nope.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Auntie and Pacyinz, for the. I'm sorry about that. This is really beautiful to be able to have an insight into what grandfather went through. So it's very interesting to have seen all the history behind this. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing this part.
So it's Shannara's grandfather. So Pacyinz, it's your, yeah, it's pretty amazing. Thank you. Anyone else? Miho, you have any comment?
You know, I knew like a textbook sort of, story of the wars in like Vietnam and of course Japanese invasion of all over Asia. And actually my mother was in Manchuria. She grew up in Manchuria. My husband was with the US Air Force, he's American, and he was in Vietnam combat as well. So, without knowing, just my life is very close to all what was happening. And until I lived in Hong Kong in the 90s, I really didn't know what the Japanese military was doing. And then I went to many study groups and I met so many people. So I heard, different stories. Then, I found out a lot. And so it's been maybe just only 20 years I've known about it, to grow up without knowing, really. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a lot more for me to discover and think about. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope you find your grandfather's remains, really. Someday, maybe it'll happen. Thank you.
I think these stories were.
You can't see your face, Luke, but that's okay.
All right. Yeah, I'm in the dark. I think these stories were very interesting because it makes these stories more complex. The more you get into intimate stories, you see the choices that people have to make, because a lot of times people may see some groups who align with the imperialists as just puppets, but they are making calculations and they're trying to navigate complex situations. So having these personal stories fleshes out the larger picture, because the larger picture just gives us generally stereotypes in terms of groups and what they're doing. So this is a very insightful and gives us a deeper understanding of the complexities of that war.
Thank you, Luke. Bas, yes?
Yes, I would like to thank you for basically humanizing the other side. My grandfather was involved at the tail end of World War II, fought in Korea and fought in Vietnam. And he was very deeply affected by it. But of course, him being on the other side, all I really heard about the other side was basically a combination of the pain of, well, murdering people in his eyes. That's how he thought of himself. And the enemy in very two-dimensional terms. So hearing you folks talk about this, it just really humanizes that other side that was basically reduced to the Chinese, because that's how it was reduced, basically. And this just opens up such a depth of perspective. Like, obviously my grandfather has his side of the story, but then I hear this side of the story, and it just makes it so much more complete. And honestly, I wish my grandfather would still be alive to actually witness this presentation, because I think it would have done a lot of good for his conscience and for him trying to understand what happened, because it really affected him. So thank you.
Yeah, the trauma is certainly intergenerational as well. I'm doing that presentation at the Breakfast Club at the museum. And then there will also be an article in the museum newsletter. So that's a way that I'm trying to document this for more people to have access to the story. I mean, there's some stuff that's published, but this will make it local. I mean, actually, really local. This is our local museum. So I'm excited. Hopefully see those folks that can be in St. Cloud at that time. That'd be fun. And go to my website and you will find more information on that. Well, we could talk all night, I'm sure. Linda, you didn't really say anything. You just smiled with James.
No, it was very interesting. I learned so much listening to both of the presentations. So I thank you for passing on what you've learned about your history with your fathers, and it brought a new understanding of a lot of that historical time period to me. So thank you.
Well, Pacyinz, I'm going to let you have the last word before we leave.
Yes, once again, I'm so thankful for to Hedy for inviting me to be part of her processes and her events. I'm always very impressed by the work that she does, and that actually, the St. Cloud community and the regional arts community is doing to understand the diversity of Minnesotans and Americans, actually. So I think I live in bigger cities, and we have more exposures to a lot of things, but it is so critical to also have the richness of the American fabric at the regional and local levels. So I'm very glad to be part of this. Minnesota has been, my home for many years. So I always feel like this is a coming home as well, being part of Minnesotan events. So thank you everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to Heather. And why don't Heather take us away? Then you can cut off the recording.
Thank you all. Thanks, Hedy. Thanks, Pacyinz.
Right, we'll see you